The photograph was meant to preserve sorrow, not conjure nightmares. It was the autumn of 1871, in a quiet, wind-brushed corner of rural Tennessee, a town too small for maps and too old for gossip. Samuel and Clara Harper had buried their only daughter, 8-year-old Evelyn, just 2 days before. Pneumonia had taken her quickly, stealing her breath before dawn and leaving their farmhouse wrapped in silence. Out of grief and tradition, the Harpers hired a traveling photographer to capture one last memory, a final portrait beside the coffin, something to hold on to after the world forgot. His name was Isaac Bell, a man known for his soft voice and strange patience, the kind photographers needed in those days of long exposures and fragile glass plates. He arrived with his horse-drawn wagon, unpacking his camera with the delicacy of a priest preparing a relic. The Harpers led him inside to the parlor, where the small white coffin had been placed near the window to let the October light fall across it. Evelyn lay dressed in pale cotton, her hair brushed smooth, her favorite doll tucked in beside her arm. Belle set the camera before the family and whispered for them not to move. The air was heavy, the clock ticking loud in the silence. The shutter opened with a slow, aching sound, and for a moment, the Harpers swore they felt something stir in the room. When the photograph was developed several days later, Bell would claim his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the glass plate. At first, he saw what he expected, the grieving parents, faces drained and hollow, standing beside the coffin. But then his eyes lifted toward the faint reflection in the parlor window. There, blurred yet impossibly distinct, stood a second figure, small, pale, and facing outward. It was Evelyn. She was standing. Her eyes were open, looking through the window pane as though she had simply risen from her coffin to see what lay beyond. The detail was unmistakable, the same cotton dress, the same ribbon tied in her hair. Only the expression was different, a faint, almost knowing half-smile that made Bell's stomach twist. He examined the plate for exposure faults, double images, light leaks. Nothing explained it. The room in the photograph appeared too dark for reflections, and the child's figure cast a subtle shadow on the inside of the glass. When Bell delivered the final print to the Harpers, he wrapped it carefully in paper and said nothing. But when Clara opened it, she let out a sound that no living man could forget, a single note of disbelief that curdled into horror. Samuel snatched the print away, his lips trembling. This isn't possible," he whispered. Bell said nothing, but in the faint lamplight of that farmhouse, the eyes in the photograph seemed to follow them all. In the days that followed, the photograph became both a comfort and a curse. At first, Clara refused to believe it was real. She insisted it was a trick of the glass, a double exposure, something Bell's chemicals had done. Yet she couldn't stop staring at her daughter's image, that faint, unblinking gaze from beyond the window. Samuel tried to burn the picture once. He carried it out to the barn, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner, but the photograph wouldn't catch. The paper browned, curled, and then went cold, as if some invisible hand had snuffed the fire out. He buried it instead, beneath the oak tree behind their house, and told Clara it was gone. But that night, when she woke to the sound of tapping on the parlor window, the picture was lying on her bedside table, spotless, untouched, and cold to the touch. From that night on, the farmhouse changed. The clocks began to tick irregularly. Lamps flickered no matter how tightly their wicks were trimmed. Clara swore she heard her daughter humming in the halls, the same lullaby she sang before bed. Samuel stopped sleeping altogether, sitting by the fire until dawn, the photograph hidden in his coat pocket, as though keeping it close somehow kept the rest of the house calm. Isaac Bell, the photographer, heard about these disturbances from the townsfolk weeks later. They said the Harpers' lights burned all night long now, and that Clara had taken to speaking softly to the windows, as if someone were on the other side listening. Curious, or perhaps guilty, Bell returned to the Harper home one gray afternoon, carrying his camera once again. He wanted to prove what he'd seen was a mistake of light, not a visitation from beyond. But when he stepped into the parlor, his breath caught. There, on the windowsill, lay the photograph, and the glass itself bore a faint, frost-like outline of a child's handprint. Belle called out, but no one answered. The house was empty, dust floating in the afternoon light. He picked up the photograph and felt a chill spread through his fingers. The figure in the window was clearer now. Evelyn's face almost luminous, her smile wider, her hand pressed against the pane. In the glass reflection of his own eyes, Belle swore he saw movement, a flicker, like someone standing just behind him. When he turned, the room was still. He packed his camera in silence and left the house without looking back. By the time he returned to town, the Harpers were gone. No one ever saw them again. Years passed, and the Harper farmhouse began to rot quietly at the edge of town. By the 1880s, vines had consumed its porch and the windows sagged inward, like blind eyes that had seen too much. People stopped walking the old road entirely after sundown. Children whispered that if you passed the Harper property at night, you could see a flicker of light in the upstairs window, the glow of a single lantern and the silhouette of a little girl peering out. The photograph itself, according to rumor, surfaced again when the property was sold off in 1884. A new couple, the Millers, had moved in, a schoolteacher and his wife who scoffed at the superstitions of the locals. They found the image tucked between the floorboards in the parlor, wrapped in a rotting cloth. Though the picture was nearly 20 years old, the ink was still sharp, the girl in the window unchanged. But what disturbed Mrs. Miller most wasn't the clarity of the print. It was that the house outside the window wasn't the Harper home. It was their home, unmistakably. The same gabled roof, the same crooked fence, even the faint outline of a laundry line she had strung just days before. It was as if the photograph had rewritten itself to show them instead of the Harpers. At first, they laughed it off, a strange coincidence, a trick of the mind. But over the next few weeks, things began to unravel. Mrs. Miller found the photograph moved each morning, sometimes placed neatly on the kitchen table, other times leaning against the parlor window. Her husband accused her of doing it, but one night, when both of them were in bed, they heard the soft scrape of glass from downstairs. When they rushed down, the photograph was lying face up on the floor beneath the window pane, and a small, distinct handprint was pressed into the dust beside it. No one else had been in the house. The next day, the schoolteacher took the photo into town, demanding that Isaac Bell, now an older man with trembling hands, examine it. Bell turned pale the moment he saw it. He refused to touch it, muttering only that some things keep taking their picture long after the subject is gone. That night, the Millers packed what they could and left, leaving the farmhouse and the photograph behind. It stayed there for decades, locked in silence and shadow, waiting for the next family to forget the stories. By 1906, the Harper farmhouse was little more than a ruin swallowed by weeds and whispers. When a traveling historian named Eleanor Birch came through rural Illinois cataloging forgotten homes, she was drawn to its eerie stillness. The locals refused to go near it, warning her of the girl in the window. Eleanor, a skeptic by nature, found such superstition amusing. She entered the decaying house one quiet afternoon, sunlight spilling through the holes in the roof like pale smoke. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. But what caught her attention wasn't the rot. It was the photograph, sitting perfectly upright on the mantel, free of dust, as though someone had just placed it there. The image was crisp despite the decades, a family of four, the Harpers, standing proudly by their home. And there, in the upstairs window, a child's face, expressionless yet watchful. But something about the photograph was wrong. Eleanor noted that the window pane seemed newer than the rest of the house, as though it had been replaced. When she compared the structure in the photograph to the ruins before her, the angles didn't match. It was as though the house in the image had subtly changed, evolved, while the real one decayed. Eleanor brought the photo back to her temporary lodgings in town and spent hours studying it by lamplight. When she closed her eyes, she swore she could still see the faint outline of that child's face, hovering just beyond memory. Locals, upon learning she had taken it, began crossing themselves when she passed. One elderly farmer warned her that things left behind by grief don't forget where they came from. That night, As rain hammered against her window, she woke to the sound of something tapping the glass. Rhythmic, deliberate. She froze. When she turned her head, her breath caught, for there, reflected in the dark pane, was the outline of a small figure standing behind her. She spun around. Nothing. Only her oil lamp flickering weakly on the desk, and the photograph, now turned to face the window. The next morning, Eleanor's journal entries abruptly stopped. The townsfolk later found her room untouched, her luggage neatly packed. But Eleanor herself was gone, and in her place, resting against the pillow, was the Harper photograph, the girl in the window now smiling faintly, as though she had just been reunited with someone. By the early 1920s, the Harper photograph had gained a quiet, unnerving reputation. It surfaced at an estate auction in Chicago, where an anonymous bidder purchased it for a small fortune. Those who handled the auction said the picture made them feel as if someone was watching from inside it. The buyer was later revealed to be Dr. Walter Greaves, a historian with an obsession for death imagery and Victorian mourning customs. Greaves intended to study the print for evidence of double exposure, a common trick used by spirit photographers. He locked himself away in his study, analyzing it under candlelight. But over the course of several weeks, something began to change. In his personal notes, later recovered by his assistant, he wrote of subtle shifts in the image. The girl's eyes, once pale and still, now seemed to look directly toward him. On one occasion, he claimed to have seen a reflection in her pupil, a small oil lamp, though no such light was visible in the room when the photo was taken. Greaves dismissed it as his imagination at first, but soon he began waking in the middle of the night to the sound of faint knocking, 3 slow taps, always from the direction of his study. When Greaves's assistant finally entered the study after his employer failed to answer for 2 days, the scene was hauntingly still. The photograph lay propped on the desk, perfectly centered. Greaves himself sat in the armchair, eyes open, expression oddly peaceful, as if he had died mid-thought. But there was one detail that sent a chill through everyone who saw it. A streak of condensation, like a child's small handprint, pressed against the inside of the study window. The photograph was confiscated and placed in storage by the local university, though rumors spread that the archivist assigned to document it left his position within a month, citing persistent nightmares and auditory hallucinations. No official record mentions the Harper family again after that, and yet, the photo resurfaced every few decades, found in estate sales, hidden in antique stores, left behind in attics. Each time, the story followed the same pattern: curiosity, obsession, disappearance. It was never the same owner twice, but it was always the same photograph, the girl in the window, eyes faintly alive. By the early 2000s, the Harper photograph had faded into obscurity, at least until Evelyn Marks, a graduate student in rural folklore, stumbled upon it while researching death photography for her thesis at a small Midwestern university. She was fascinated by the legends surrounding it, though her professor warned her to avoid superstitious material. Still, when she opened the university archive's cold metal drawer and found the envelope labeled Harper Burial, 1871, her curiosity overcame every hesitation. Inside was the photograph, brittle, sepia-toned, but strangely well-preserved. The girl's figure in the window was exactly as the descriptions said: pale, distant, yet hauntingly alert. Evelyn decided to digitize the image, believing modern scanners could reveal the truth, perhaps proving it was merely a trick of light. She uploaded it to her workstation, magnified the resolution, and adjusted the contrast. But the higher she pushed the clarity, the worse it became. The shadows didn't flatten, they deepened. Behind the girl's face, new patterns began to appear: faint outlines of a hand, a curve of something like hair, and what looked like a reflection of someone standing just outside the frame. The image flickered briefly, once, then again, before stabilizing. Evelyn laughed nervously, assuming it was her outdated scanner glitching from overuse. But later that night, when she checked the image on her laptop, the girl's eyes were facing forward. Evelyn swore she had adjusted nothing. She compared the scan to the original, and the difference was undeniable. The girl's pupils were now aligned with the lens, fixed on whoever viewed the image. The next morning, Evelyn called the photography lab to ask if anyone else had accessed her computer remotely, but the log showed no external connection. That night, unable to sleep, she opened the file again. This time, her laptop camera light blinked, just once, as if something was watching her. When she reviewed the scan frame by frame, she noticed faint distortions along the edges, as if condensation had formed between her screen and the image itself. Then came the whisper, so soft it almost blended with the fan hum. A single phrase, stretched and broken by static. "Let me in." Terrified, Evelyn unplugged her computer and shoved it into a drawer. The next day, she contacted her professor and asked to drop the project. But when the department staff went to clear her workstation 2 days later, both the computer and the original Harper photograph were missing. The surveillance cameras caught nothing, except for one brief frame, a reflection in the archive's window, a small, pale face pressed against the glass. Months passed before anyone mentioned the Harper photo again. Then, one autumn morning in 2004, a user on an early paranormal message board posted a grainy screenshot titled, "The Girl Who Watched Herself Die." The image looked almost identical to Evelyn's digital scan, though its metadata was corrupted and its upload traced to no known IP address. Commenters joked that it was one of those chain post ghost photos, the kind meant to spook gullible users. But as the thread grew, strange things started to happen. One user claimed their monitor flickered when they zoomed in on the girl's face. Another swore they saw a faint outline of frost forming on their screen. Within a week, moderators took the post down, citing malware interference. But the image had already spread. It jumped from forums to personal blogs, then onto early social media sites, shared with the caption, "Look at her eyes for 5 seconds. She looks back." Screenshots multiplied faster than anyone could remove them, each more distorted than the last. Some versions showed subtle changes. The window cracked, the shadows lengthened, and in one copy, a faint reflection appeared behind the photographer. People dismissed these as manipulations, digital hoaxes. Yet reports from those who had saved the image began to surface privately. Missing data files, inexplicable whispers from speakers, and in one unsettling case, an art student who claimed her camera froze mid-click, leaving behind a perfectly clear photo of a young girl watching her from a window. By winter, the Harper photograph had become an online mystery, dubbed the Window Girl of 1871. Amateur researchers dug through public archives, piecing together what little remained of the Harper family's history. They discovered that the farmhouse still stood, abandoned for decades, outside a nearly forgotten Kansas township swallowed by farmland. A group of urban explorers visited in 2006, documenting their trip on an early video site. Their footage began innocently. The barn collapsed, the parlor empty, and the walls painted with mold. But halfway through, as the camera panned toward a boarded-up window, the lens flared. For less than a second, a childlike silhouette appeared behind the boards, translucent, motionless, yet perfectly centered in the frame. The explorers fled, laughing nervously about how creepy it looked in playback. 3 days later, the video vanished from their channel. The uploader's account was deleted, and only a cached thumbnail remained, showing a single still of the boarded window, cracked open just enough for a small, pale eye to be visible. The forum community erupted with theories. Some said the image carried a digital curse. Others believed Evelyn, the student who disappeared, had become trapped within the scan itself. But beneath the memes and disbelief, a darker question lingered. If the girl in the photograph was watching, what was she waiting for? In 2007, the Harper photograph caught the attention of a small-time documentary filmmaker named Thomas Vail. Thomas was known in underground circles for chasing forgotten American folklore, ghost towns, unmarked graves, lost photographs. When he stumbled upon The Window Girl of 1871, he thought it was perfect material for his next project, a low-budget series on historical hauntings. What intrigued him most wasn't the photo's supposed curse, but how tangible the details were. the date, the family, the farmhouse. Most haunted photos online were modern fabrications, but this one had records attached to it, burial logs, census mentions, even a reference in an 1880 obituary notice for a Mr. Samuel Harper, widower. Thomas gathered a small crew and set out to Kansas that summer. Their footage began like any other rural exploration. Empty roads stretching between fields of yellowed wheat, skies heavy with heat. The town nearest the Harper farm, Dry Creek, was almost entirely deserted. Locals didn't talk much, but when Thomas mentioned the photograph, the few who remembered it grew visibly uncomfortable. One elderly man warned them, "Don't stay past sundown near that place. It ain't the house that's haunted, it's the window." The crew laughed, chalking it up to small-town superstition, yet Thomas couldn't shake the way the man's voice had quivered when he said it. They reached the Harper property by dusk. The farmhouse sat tilted against the horizon, its roof caved in on one side, the wood swollen gray from decades of storms. Around it, the land was eerily still. No birds, no insects, just wind sighing through cracks in the boards. Thomas began filming his introduction near the front porch while his sound technician tested equipment. On playback, a faint hum could be heard beneath Thomas's narration. Not wind, not static, but something rhythmic, almost like breathing. They brushed it off as a mic issue and moved inside. The parlor was almost intact, peeling wallpaper, a rusted stove, and a picture frame lying face down in the corner. When one of the crew flipped it over, there it was, the same photograph. Or rather, a duplicate of it. The same girl, the same window, the same angle. Except her face was slightly turned. Her eyes, once looking out the window, now seemed to meet the lens directly. Thomas froze, unsure whether it was a trick of memory or light. The crew wanted to leave, but he insisted on filming one last segment in front of the window before dark. The camera rolled, capturing his voice trembling mid-sentence, right before the reflection of a second child appeared in the glass behind him. That night, the team set up camp in what used to be the Harper family's barn, safer than sleeping inside the collapsing house, or so they thought. The generator hummed softly as Thomas transferred the day's footage to his laptop. Everyone gathered around the flickering screen, half exhausted, half thrilled to see what they'd captured. For the first few minutes, everything appeared ordinary. Shots of the broken fence, a slow pan across the parlor, the window reflecting the dying sunset. But when Thomas reached the moment he'd filmed his closing statement, a chill rippled through the barn. There, just behind him in the frame, was a small, pale face pressed against the glass. It wasn't the reflection of any crew member. The shape was wrong, too childlike, too still. The girl's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and her mouth hung open as if mid-silent scream. Thomas paused the video. No one spoke. One of the sound guys, Jared, rewound it, frame by frame, insisting it had to be pareidolia, a trick of the brain. But as they stepped through the frames, the figure's head moved. Not in a glitch or a lighting shift, but intentionally, following Thomas as he turned away. The crew sat frozen. The laptop's fan whirred louder, matching the tension in the air. Then, from somewhere outside, a soft tapping echoed, faint, rhythmic, like fingernails against glass. Jared stood, his flashlight cutting through the dark toward the farmhouse. "It's just wind hitting loose boards," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. When the beam landed on the house, it illuminated the window, the same one from the photo. Something was there, standing behind it. A shadow, small and still, watching them. Thomas grabbed his camera, driven by a mix of fear and compulsion, and zoomed in. Through the flicker of the viewfinder, the outline solidified, the same dress, the same posture, the unmistakable shape of a little girl. But there was something else too, movement beside her. Another, taller shadow, indistinct but close enough that for a split second, it looked like an adult's hand resting on her shoulder. Then the light cut out. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the barn into silence so thick it felt alive. No one dared move for several seconds. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Pack up. We're leaving now." He didn't make it far that night. The truck refused to start. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died, as though the cold itself had reached into the metal and snuffed out the spark. With no choice but to wait until dawn, they huddled back inside the barn. Thomas sat quietly, laptop open again, scrolling through the footage frame by frame. The image of the girl in the window appeared clearer with each pass. She was standing perfectly still, hands flat against the glass, her eyes vacant, yet somehow aware. Behind her, the taller shadows seemed to shift, stretching from one side of the room to the other as if drawn out of shape by the light. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, too thin, too elongated, its head tilted in a way that didn't make sense. As Thomas watched, his cursor hovered over one frame that hadn't been there before, a single blurred image between transitions. He enhanced it, and there, hidden in motion blur, was something unmistakable, the faint outline of his own reflection, but with the little girl's eyes. For the first time that night, Thomas closed the laptop, pressing his palms against his temples. "We didn't capture her," he whispered. "She captured us." The rest of the crew tried to brush it off as exhaustion, tricks of low light and paranoia, but none of them slept. Each hour dragged slower than the last, punctuated by noises outside. Footsteps in the frost, the creak of the old windmill that hadn't turned in years, and the occasional soft sound of laughter. Too close, too childlike. When dawn finally came, they packed in silence. The truck roared to life as if nothing had been wrong. No one looked back as they drove off the property, though Thomas couldn't help glancing into the side mirror. The house grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by fog. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the window again, the girl's pale face framed by tattered curtains. But when he blinked, it was gone. Back in town, they reviewed the footage again on a proper monitor. The shadow behind the girl was gone. Frame after frame, it simply vanished, as if erased. But one new thing appeared instead. In the last seconds before the generator cut, a reflection in the window, not of Thomas, but of the barn itself, and the faint outline of 5 figures standing inside. Only 4 had been in there that night. Thomas returned to his small apartment in Topeka 2 days later, exhausted but unable to shake the sense that something had followed him. He told himself it was nerves, that his mind was still tangled in the cold stillness of that forgotten farm. But that night, when he plugged in his camera to transfer the files, he noticed something strange. Every folder was intact except one. The footage from the final night, the one with the 6th figure in the window, had been renamed on its own. The new title simply read, "Look Behind You." Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The room was still. The hum of the computer filled the silence. Slowly, he turned, half expecting to see someone there. Nothing. Just the dim light spilling through his blinds and the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat. But on the screen, a new thumbnail appeared, a still image that hadn't existed before. It was the same barn, same window. Only this time, the reflection wasn't of the girl or her shadow. It was Thomas, standing in front of the camera, looking directly into the lens, though he'd never taken that shot. He deleted the file immediately, but the computer froze. The cursor blinked stubbornly, refusing to move. Then the speakers crackled, faint at first, then clearer, the sound of a child humming. The same tune that had echoed through the barn. Thomas slammed the lid shut and yanked the plug from the wall. The humming stopped instantly, but something lingered in the air, a static pressure, as if the room itself had drawn breath. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he convinced himself it had to be a prank. Maybe someone on the team was trying to mess with him. He called them all, one by one, but no one answered. When he finally reached Evan, the sound engineer, his voice trembled. "Don't call me again," Evan said. "I don't want to talk about her." Then the line went dead. Thomas stared at his phone for a long time before realizing something even more disturbing. The reflection on his dark laptop screen wasn't his. It was the window from the photograph, and behind it, the faintest outline of a small figure pressing her hands against the glass. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and gnawing paranoia. Thomas stopped using his camera, stopped turning on his laptop. But the presence didn't need the screens anymore. It had found another way in. It started small, the faint sound of fingernails against the window pane when he tried to sleep. A slow, deliberate tapping that stopped whenever he got too close. He moved the curtains aside one night, certain he'd catch the source, but there was nothing outside except the reflection of his own tired eyes. Then he noticed something wrong with that reflection. His eyes weren't blinking in sync. The mirrored version of himself blinked first, slow, unnatural, like something testing human motion. Thomas stumbled back, the glass fogging with his breath. That's when he saw it again, faint and ghostly. The shape of a small girl, her forehead pressed to the glass from the inside, even though he was standing there, on the room's only side. Her expression was not angry or menacing. It was pleading. By morning, the glass bore faint smudges, 2 small handprints, the size of a child's, on the inside of the window. He tried cleaning them off, but they wouldn't fade. He covered the window with a blanket and decided to leave for a few days, maybe stay with a friend. But the hum followed him. In his car, the radio turned on by itself, whispering static that almost sounded like words. When he parked outside his friend's house, the porch light flickered 3 times, in perfect rhythm with the tapping that had haunted him at home. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. And then, in the reflection of the windshield, he saw her sitting in the back seat. Not solid, but there, faint, transparent. Her pale eyes locked on him as her lips moved soundlessly. The glass around her shimmered with condensation, forming the words, "You looked at me." Thomas stumbled out of the car, gasping, but the back seat was empty. Yet his phone buzzed in his pocket, a new photo notification. No sender, just one image. The barn window, taken from the outside, with his car clearly visible in the reflection. Thomas couldn't ignore it anymore. Every instinct screamed to run, but curiosity, or maybe guilt, kept pulling him back to that farmhouse in the photo. He began searching through town archives, old death records, and newspaper clippings from the late 19th century. What he found turned his fascination into horror. In the fall of 1871, the farmhouse had belonged to a family named Harlow, farmers who lived just outside a small rural town. Their daughter, Clara, was 9 years old when she fell ill and died during a terrible fever outbreak that swept through the area. According to local lore, the family couldn't afford a coffin right away, so her body was kept in the parlor for several days while they waited for the undertaker to arrive. On the morning of the burial, a traveling photographer came through town, offering to take what was known then as a mourning photograph, a final image of the dead before they were laid to rest. The Harlows agreed, believing it would preserve her memory forever. But when the plates were developed, the image showed something that horrified everyone. Clara, in her coffin, sitting upright, her eyes faintly open. The photographer was accused of trickery, of doctoring the image, but he swore it was untouched. Days later, he vanished without a trace. The Harlows, stricken by grief and shame, sealed the parlor and never spoke of the incident again. But whispers spread across the countryside, stories that Clara's spirit had never left that window where she'd been last seen. Locals claimed that on cold nights, her face could be seen pressed against the glass, watching the fields. Some said her family moved away soon after, unable to bear the sound of footsteps pacing above them when the house was still. Thomas pieced these fragments together, cross-referencing them with the location data embedded in his photograph. It matched perfectly. The barn in his image stood on what used to be the Harlow property, the same spot where the farmhouse had burned down 50 years after Clara's death. He realized then that the picture he'd found wasn't just eerie coincidence. It was invitation. Someone, or something, wanted to be seen again. It was almost midnight when Thomas arrived at the remains of what had once been the Harlow farmhouse. The field was silent, the kind of stillness that only old farmland carries, heavy with memory and forgotten sorrow. He parked his car near the rusted gate and stepped out, flashlight trembling in his grip. The air was thick with the scent of soil and rain, the remnants of an earlier storm clinging to the grass. What was left of the farmhouse stood like a skeleton, blackened timbers, collapsed beams, and fragments of charred wallpaper barely visible beneath the vines. As he approached the ruins, His light caught the outline of a single standing wall. Embedded within it, remarkably intact, was a window frame. The glass was cracked, fogged from age, yet something about it felt preserved, untouched by time. Thomas's heart pounded. It was the same window from the photograph. He could tell by the distinct lattice pattern etched into the corners, identical to the one in Clara's burial image. He lifted his camera instinctively, aiming through the viewfinder, as if compelled to recreate that century-old moment. But before he could press the shutter, a faint outline appeared on the other side of the glass, small, pale, and motionless. He froze. The outline sharpened, the figure of a young girl, her hands resting against the pane. Her face was faint, washed in spectral gray, yet her eyes seemed aware. Thomas staggered backward, the beam of his flashlight flickering across the ruined wall. For a split second, he thought it was a trick, moisture, reflection, or his own nerves. But when he blinked, the girl tilted her head slightly, just as she had in the photograph from 1871. The movement was slow, deliberate. The glass began to fog from the inside, forming the shape of a small handprint pressed against it. Thomas lowered his camera, breathing hard, a low ringing in his ears drowning out the whisper of the night wind. He whispered her name without meaning to, Clara. The temperature dropped instantly, his breath visible in the beam of light. The handprint faded, and in its place, he saw writing forming in the condensation. He never left. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the writing vanished. Thomas stumbled back toward his car, but every step felt slower, heavier, as though something unseen moved in rhythm with him. Thomas barely made it back to his car. The words on the window looped inside his head like a broken record. He never left. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes, unable to start the engine, staring out at the dark shape of the house dissolving into mist. The historian in him tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Moisture patterns, pareidolia, exhaustion. But another part of him, the quiet part that understood grief, knew there had been intention behind those words. The next morning, after a sleepless night, he drove to the county archives in town. The clerk, a woman who looked like she had grown up hearing every rural ghost story imaginable, led him to a box of property records dated 1870 through 1890. Inside, Thomas found deeds, mortgage papers, and one folded affidavit with the name Samuel Harlow stamped across it in fading ink. The document was a statement written by Clara's father weeks after her death. His handwriting trembled even through the decades. "May the Lord forgive me for the sin I hide beneath our home. She looks out from her window, and I know he never left." The phrase sent a chill through Thomas's spine. He, it seemed, wasn't Clara. It was something else, someone still lingering when he shouldn't have been. Further notes from the local sheriff's log painted a grim picture. Samuel Harlow had hired a farmhand named Elijah Brent, a drifter with no family, who vanished 2 weeks before Clara's mysterious fever and death. Witnesses claimed they'd seen the two arguing near the barn late at night. The sheriff never investigated. The records simply stated farmhand presumed gone. But Samuel's affidavit hinted otherwise. The ground shakes when it rains, as if he knocks to be let out. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The cellar, the one that used to sit directly beneath the window where Clara had been photographed, was never mentioned again in any later renovation plans. The words "he never left" now felt literal. That night, Thomas returned to the ruins, drawn by the compulsion of truth. Standing before the window once more, he brushed aside the creeping ivy near the foundation. And there, just beneath the earth's surface, he saw the outline of a wooden door, sunken and sealed by decades of mud. Thomas knelt in the wet grass, his breath clouding in the chill night air as he clawed away the mud from the cellar door. The wood, soft with rot, gave way beneath his fingers, releasing a stale, heavy odor that reeked of earth and time. When the last of the soil fell away, he found an iron latch, rusted but intact. The historian in him whispered that this was his moment, a discovery that could rewrite the legend of the Harlow farm. But the deeper, instinctive part of him warned that some histories were never meant to be unearthed. He took a deep breath, grasped the latch, and pulled. The door creaked open with a sound like a dying breath, and a wave of air rolled up from below, thick, cold, and sweet with decay. Thomas's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, landing on wooden stairs that spiraled down into the earth. Every step creaked as he descended, the echo of his movement swallowed by the damp walls. At the bottom, he found the remnants of a small room, stone-lined, with shelves eaten away by mold. But it was the center of the cellar that froze him. There, partially collapsed and caked in soil, was a wooden box roughly the length of a man. Beside it, in the muck, glimmered the faint curve of a rusted shovel. Thomas approached slowly. His flashlight trembled as he traced the name carved into the box, Elijah Brent. He swallowed hard. This wasn't a coffin made by mourning hands. It was one built in haste, buried and hidden beneath the home. The truth was clear now. Samuel Harlow had murdered the farmhand and sealed him in the earth beneath his daughter's room. But then something in the corner of the cellar caught the light. Faint, wet movement, as if something stirred. Thomas lifted the beam toward it and saw a handprint form in the grime of the wall, slick with moisture. Then another. They dragged downward, slow and deliberate. His breath hitched as the air grew thick, pressing against his chest. From above, a faint sound echoed through the floorboards, the window rattling in its frame. And then, through the distant creak of glass, came a whisper that slid through the dark like breath over his ear. He never left. Thomas stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The cellar went black, the door above him slamming shut with the weight of a century's secret locking him in. The cellar swallowed the sound of Thomas's scream. His flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, plunging him into a suffocating blackness that felt alive. The air pressed down on him, thick and wet like he'd stepped inside a lung. He groped along the wall, his fingers sliding over cold stone slick with condensation, searching for the stairs. But the cellar seemed deeper than before, the space shifting, the angles bending. He could hear the faint dripping of water, or maybe blood, in a slow, irregular rhythm. Then came a sound behind him, a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt floor. His breath caught. He turned, eyes straining in the dark, and in the pitch black he saw nothing, but he felt it. The presence. It was as though the air itself leaned closer to him. The whisper returned, this time clearer, right by his ear. He never left her side. Thomas staggered backward, tripping over the broken shovel, crashing against the coffin. His hands landed on the lid, and he felt movement beneath it. A shift, a thud, then silence. He froze, heart hammering so violently he could hear it in his ears. Then, from within the coffin, came 3 slow knocks. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, as if something beneath wanted out. Thomas stumbled to his feet, fumbling in his bag for the emergency flashlight. When it finally flared to life, he wished it hadn't. The coffin lid had slid open by an inch, and from that narrow gap seeped a thin trail of black liquid that glimmered like oil. The smell hit him, rot and copper, sweet and vile. He took a step closer, hands shaking, and aimed the beam into the opening. What he saw made him reel back. Inside wasn't a skeleton, but something soft, glistening, shifting, as if flesh had never quite decayed. A pale hand shot upward, fingers curling over the edge of the box. Thomas screamed, dropped the flashlight, and sprinted for the stairs. But when he reached them, they were gone, swallowed by the dark. Only the coffin remained, its lid now half open, the sound of wet breathing filling the air. Thomas pressed himself against the far wall, panting, flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam darted wildly across the cellar, catching the edges of jars, broken tools, the coffin now gaping open like a wound. The hand was gone, but something had changed in the air. The cold no longer felt natural, it pulsed, almost breathing with him. Then came the faint hum of a lullaby, one he recognized from the burial records. The mother, Abigail Hollis, had sung it to her daughter before she was buried. His heart sank as he followed the sound to the far end of the room, where a small child's rocking chair began to move on its own, creaking back and forth. The song grew louder. Thomas aimed the light at the chair and saw, sitting within it, a faint outline. A child's form, translucent, eyes dark as empty sockets but wet, as though still crying. "You weren't meant to see," the little girl whispered. Her voice was layered, like more than one person was speaking through her. The rocking slowed. "He kept me here. He said the ground wasn't ready for me." Thomas's throat went dry. "Who kept you?" he managed to whisper, though the words barely left his lips. The girl's gaze lifted toward the ceiling, toward the old house above. "Father." The words seemed to echo off the cellar walls. Images flickered in Thomas's mind. The photograph, the pale man in the window, the faint silhouette behind the curtains. "He promised he'd come for me when the storm stopped," the child continued, her voice breaking. "But he never left. He watched the window, always waiting." The rocking chair stopped abruptly, and for a moment, silence returned, until the foundation of the house creaked above him, slow and heavy, as if someone were walking across the floorboards. Footsteps, deliberate, dragging, headed toward the cellar door. Thomas's blood froze as the latch clicked. The door began to open on its own, groaning like an ancient throat clearing after a century of silence. A shadow filled the doorway, tall, crooked, and still. The cellar door shuddered open fully, and the figure that stood there was not entirely solid. Thomas could make out the outline of a man, tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like a black funeral coat, the edges of his body flickering like film left too long in the projector's heat. The lantern beside Thomas dimmed, the air rippling as if time itself bent around the apparition. The man's face was indistinct, the shadows crawling where eyes should have been. But Thomas could sense the weight of a stare pressing against him. "Why are you here?" the figure asked, the voice like wind scraping through hollow pipes. Thomas stammered. I came to understand what happened here." To her. The ghost tilted its head slightly, almost human, almost tender. "She was never meant to be shown," he murmured. "They took her picture when the light was wrong. It let something in." Thomas's heart pounded. The photo, the one with her in the window. The man's shape wavered, the voice sinking lower. That was not her looking out. That was what took her place. A violent tremor shook the house above them, dust falling from the beams as the apparition stepped closer. Thomas backed into the cold brick wall, the child's chair toppling over. "You have to leave," the ghost said, but it sounded less like a warning and more like a plea. "Before it remembers you." Thomas's flashlight flickered out completely, leaving only the dull orange of the lantern's last breath. And then, in that half-light, the figure's face came into focus, not a man at all, but a hollow shell, the jaw hanging open wider than natural, the eyes receding into endless dark. From the corner, the little girl began to hum again, her voice trembling through every wall. "He thought he buried me," she sang, "but I stayed." The ghost turned sharply toward her, its head twisting too far, cracking like burnt wood. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed. Thomas felt the air squeeze around him, pressure building in his skull, and in that last instant before fainting, he saw something in the ghost's hands. The same photograph, only now, it was developing before his eyes, the image forming not in silver and light, but in veins and living skin. When Thomas awoke, dawn light seeped through the cracks of the boarded windows, a thin, colorless ray slicing through the dust. The cellar was empty. No ghost, no photograph, no sign that anyone had ever been there. His lantern was cold, his hands streaked with dirt as though he'd clawed at the floor in his sleep. The house above was still. The only sound came from the faint creak of the wind through the roof's broken shingles. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing too loud in the silence. And when he reached the parlor, the table where the photograph had rested was bare. Except, there was one sheet of aged, curling paper beneath the sunlight. His pulse quickened as he lifted it. The image had changed. The girl in the window was no longer staring outside. She was facing the camera now. And behind her, standing faintly in the gloom of the room, was him, Thomas, the same coat, the same uneasy tilt of his head. He dropped the photo instantly, breath ragged. Somehow, the house had taken his likeness, as if adding him to its story, to its curse. By nightfall, the house was gone. When townspeople came searching, drawn by the echo of a man's screams carried miles by the wind, they found nothing but a collapsed foundation and the remains of scorched timber. Yet among the ashes, the sheriff recovered a single photograph that refused to burn. It showed a girl at a window and a man beside her, both blurred and strange, their faces half-formed as if the image were still breathing. The photo was locked away, passed through hands in whispered fear, before vanishing from record decades later. But every few years, in different parts of Kansas, people claim to find the same image, tucked in antique stores, abandoned trunks, or inside forgotten books. Always reappearing, always slightly changed. The girl's eyes move a little more each time. Some swear if you stare long enough, you can see your own reflection begin to form behind her, as if the photograph is waiting for its next subject. And so, the story of the girl in the window remains unfinished, a haunting reminder that in the dim, flickering light of history, some faces were never meant to fade.